we have distance. So thanks everyone for coming. And it's a bit of a kind of an evolutionary event today. We have 2 or 3 other speakers who have texted me that they're on their way. And so let me say that today we're going to be talking about Albanians and Serbs pending issues. And we have a rather distinguished group of people who are already here and who will join us in a few minutes. And so just let me open up quickly to say exactly what the genesis of this is. And this really began with a marvelous project from the Helsinki Committee for Human Rights in Serbia, which is Sonja Biserko, who is the president of Helsinki Committee. And they have this project looking at Yugoslav history, or Jugohistoria, which covers the kind of the full range of history from actually before Yugoslavia to to after the present. And so they wanted to present their findings here in Kosovo. And so we have, and just to say a little bit about the Helsinki Committee for Human Rights, it began its mission in 1994 when Sonja founded it. Sonja Biserko is a former diplomat from the Yugoslav Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she resigned in principle. Do this. Yes, do this. Well, someone will come down right now. Okay. And so the Helsinki Committee is one of the highly principled, very practical organizations that operates in Belgrade that has been supporting refugees and minorities and doing all kinds of work, which I don't have time to go into any tremendous detail on it, just to say that they've been working here in Kosovo since the early 1990s, pretty much since they were founded, and that they have established among the very first informal dialogues between intellectuals in Serbia and intellectuals in Kosovo. And in addition to Sonja, we also have the executive director, Isabella Kisic, here with us, who has also been active in this area for a long time. So that's the kind of the genesis of this project. And in addition to Sonja, who's won many awards for human rights, she's had fellowships all over the world, including at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We will have Alexander Miletic, who just stepped up for a moment, who himself is the executive director of the Center for History Studies and Dialogue. He studied in Belgrade and then at the Central European University and completed his doctorate at the European University Institute, looking at social history, and has published some very interesting articles on the Youth History website, looking at the kind of the conceptions of Serbian leadership in the 1970s and 80s. And then joining us, I'll just introduce them right now, will be Ilber Husa, who is on his way up. Ilber is the former Kosovo ambassador to Macedonia, before it was Northern Macedonia, and also to Montenegro most recently. Ilber has a doctorate in history. He's one of the founders of ORA, the ORA party. He has been an activist in Kosovo since the 1980s and early 1990s, and was one of the founders of KOHA, and very early on played a very important role. In addition, we'll have Luzin Petsi, who is the executive director of KIPRED, the Kosovo Institute for Policy Research, and I'm not sure what ED always never stands for, but Luli was also Kosovo's ambassador to Sweden, and has been very active in these kinds of conversations and discussions ever since. And then finally, Julieta Mushkolai, like Sonia, a former member of the AUK Board of Directors, will be speaking. She's also a former judge on the Constitutional Court, and is currently a law professor at the University of Pristina. And so they will be speaking on the issues of pending issues of Albanians and Serbs. And I won't say anything else about it, but to let them speak first. And so, Sonia, you can speak up here, or you can stay down there as you wish.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out to listen to this panel. First of all, I would like to say a few words about the project, which was mentioned in the introduction note by Mark. It's an ongoing project now for 7 years, and the idea was really to sort of objectivize the history of both Yugoslavias, because we found out that many young people or new generation generally throughout former Yugoslavia have no any contact to or any, how to say, idea what Yugoslavia was. Many of them don't even know what it was about, and it's quite normal. But on the other side, the legacy of Yugoslavia is still, how to say, unresolved. Many, especially the Western Balkans, the countries that we are now whole Western Balkans is such, including Kosovo. So it's, in our view, very important to understand what it was about in order to resolve all these pending issues which are ahead of us. So, of course, Serbian and Albanian relations are very specific, comparing to other. Each of these bilateral relations has different historic dynamic and should be in a way, how to say, considered in order to be able to resolve current issues and also to reflect on the future of the region and each separate country. Serb and Albanian relations are burdened with numerous layers and stereotypes that make communication and normalization of relations very difficult. And why is that? It's mostly because Albanians are deeply traumatized by their experience with the state of Serbia, while the Serbian elite had built a narrative of Serbian innocence, especially for the war's 90s. And this is, I would say, very dangerous because it fuels aspirations based on the expectation that international circumstances will change someday in favor of Serbs. As much as it is clear that Kosovo is an independent state, it is also clear that frozen conflict suits political class in Serbia as a way of freezing the possibility of any democratic change or social justice. Kosovo, as a frozen conflict, is generating nationalism on both sides. And Serbia's mantra about compromise through dialogue, in which Serbia cannot lose everything and Kosovo gains everything, keeps the status quo maintained. Also, it keeps partition as a constant threat to the entire Balkans. I will argue why partition is not a solution either for Kosovo or Serbia, and of course for the region. First, the problematic assumption is that ethnic homogeneity guarantees stability. Between the two great wars, such solutions were preferred, but today the UN and generally it believe that ethnically based state building is based on atrocities, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity and genocide. Secondly, the real reasons leading to the conflict, as seen by scientists and local people, are weak states, that is, institutions, poverty, corruption, unequal access to resources, and of course the brutal legacy, in our case, on the Milosevic regime and the establishment of a authoritarian political system. Such a reality objectively affects minorities, even the Serbian one. Although it has representatives in the parliament, they unfortunately do not represent their interests. In essence, the interests of the Serb community are not represented by anyone, nor does anyone deal with their sustainable survival in Kosovo. They are left to themselves, and they are not in a position to resist Belgrade, which is constantly instrumentalizing them in order to challenge Kosovo's sovereignty. The best protection of minority is their integration, not separation. So the protection of their individual rights and human rights and their treatment as equal citizens. It is necessary to establish a system that will solve structural problems without excluding the community from the system. All recent researchers suggest that ethnic division does not guarantee better protection for minorities. Also, division doesn't mean greater stability after the conflict. Third, we live in a moment of false normalcy. In almost all countries of this region, we have incompetent and immature governments which pursue only their own interests. They do not resist Russian, Chinese, Turkish, and other interference. On the contrary, they are welcoming them and are really are turning in a way back to the EU reforms and the norms and the criteria, though officially they all say that they are sort of in favor of EU membership. When it comes to Belgrade, partition is still the only option under the table and on the table. Unfortunately, fortunately enough, it's off the table when we talk about the Western international community, but I'm afraid we still have those agents in favor of partition, international agents like Timothy Less, like Daniel and many others who are visiting Belgrade regularly and are probably paid by Belgrade. And Serbs in Kosovo were not and are not the actors who decide their fate, and I think this should be kept in mind. The Serbian community is also psychologically stigmatized due to the change of the power being dominant for so many decades. Now they have lost their dominant position and they're not so they're not prepared or they're to accept this new reality. And I think generally Serbia is not able to accept, to acknowledge new reality in the region, which also means to accept or recognize new borders in the region. When it comes to the relations between Serbs and Albanians, of course, they are burdened with numerous layers and stereotypes that make communication and normalization of relations difficult, because Albanians are really deeply traumatized, as I said in the beginning, and this is something that has to be worked very, how to say, sophisticated, in a very sophisticated way in order to relieve the community of this stigmatized, I would say, legacy. And of course, one important aspect of this of the situation between Serbia and Kosovo, especially in the north of Kosovo, is that organized crime has blocked both communities and prevented democratization of societies as a whole by having a monopoly over the state. But, and this is a general context which is really now burdening relations and the future of the two countries. And of course, we have two communities, Serbs in Kosovo and Albanians in Serbia, who are apparently, how to say, victims of this unresolved, how to say, statehood of Kosovo by the Serbian side. And in a way, their future and their situations are hijacked by this Belgrade policy, and they are somehow living in a vacuum without really knowing how to resolve and how to start continue their lives on both sides of the border. So I would maybe some of my colleagues also will talk about Serbian community, but I will now have a few comments on the Albanian community in Serbia itself. It is one of those minorities which are bordering Kosovo and Macedonia, and this area is considered by Serb nationalists of strategic relevance. That's why this continuous repression over the Albanian community there, especially up to 2000 after the rebellion of Albanians in the south, as a result of this repression when then Yugoslav army withdrew from Kosovo and was lying along the border. And since then, we have, especially in Medveđa, we have this constant, I would say, administrative pressure over Albanians in these three municipalities. And I think Medveđa is the worst off. Nowadays we have only about 400 Albanians living in Medveđa, and there is this, how should I say, a constant fear of what will happen next. And despite the fact that I would say all countries in the region after the 2000 were under the pressure of the EU at that time, and especially 2003 when they declared the possibility of each country to become the EU member, they were obliged to pass certain laws which would treat minorities in a way which would guarantee their integration in society. So along with other countries, also Serbia has, how should I say, very, how should I say, up to European standards, I would say, legal framework, the constitution, the law on protection of the rights and freedom of national minorities, anti-discrimination law, as also many other strategies and action plans that guarantee equality and integration of all citizens of Serbia. But they are not, unfortunately, implemented in the way as they are designed. So regardless of the presence of OSCE in this region, in the south of Serbia, they have continuously office there, and also the presence of Western embassies which regularly visit the region. This community is still living in a limbo because in expecting that the status of Kosovo will finally be resolved. So they are just hostages of this unresolved, I would say, situation. As I said, there is this approach, or this, how to say, policy of most of the countries, which maneuver, as Serbia as well, maneuver between integration of national minorities into the political system and their segregation. Despite all these normative acts which I mentioned, I would say they are really nourishing or supporting segregated multiculturalism, which maintains this ethnic distance without achieving greater integration. And it is multiculturalism, which doesn't establish bridges and cooperation between two ethno-cultural groups. And minorities, in fact, agree to this position because it still represents some kind of progress compared to the previous period. So what we are really talking about is that despite all this, I would say, monitoring from the Western community, EU and Council of Europe, and different NGOs, minorities in Serbia, especially Albanian one and Bošnjak one in Sandžak, are under the constant, I would say, atmosphere and repression, administrative, I would say, pressure, which in a way make their future very uncertain. And somehow the atmosphere is always about expecting something to happen. Most of them are hoping that the outside factors will be able to resolve their situation, but unfortunately it's not happening. The ongoing discriminatory policies of so-called passivization of residents of Albanians who are working abroad, either in Western Europe or in Kosovo, are targeting citizens who are not permanently residing on their addresses. And this measure, in a way, is ethnic cleansing, I would say, through administrative means. And passivization means, or leads, to losing the status of being a citizen of Serbia, and accordingly all civil rights, the right to vote, to property, health insurance, pension, employment, and so on. And since none of these citizens are timely informed about passivization, they found out about it only when they go to the municipality for something. They lose their right to appeal because the deadline is only 8 days. So it makes it almost impossible to make complaint. And so far they didn't have serious action led by a lawyer from the region or Belgrade who would take this case openly to Serbian parliament or to international community. We wrote, we had a fact-finding mission and we published a report, but unfortunately it was not really heard about in our media or in our political circles. In Kosovo, some people were sort of reacting to it, but nothing, there was no action followed which would take up this issue and to sort of consider it seriously in Belgrade or international community. Though the peace agreement from 2001 after the rebel in south of Serbia as a reaction to the repressive presence of Serbian army at that time, there was an agreement, peace agreement brokered by, first of all, the United States. Belgrade has not demonstrated political will to implement any of these provisions, and one of them was the early integration of Albanians into state and public institutions. At the beginning, there was an effort to include Albanians in police ranks, but only as the street policemen, and after some time it was stopped. So you literally today you have very, very few Albanians who are in state institutions and who are able to make any kind of I would say, decision-making relating to the area. Now they have a majority in Bujanovac and Preševo, but the public institutions and state institutions are mostly conducted by Serbs, and apparently they follow the instructions from Belgrade. When we talked to both Serbs and Albanians, we were told that there was no active tension or any kind of incidents taking place over the last year, but there is not real communication between two communities. For example, children go to the same school but not at the same time, so there is no actually space for their communication. Then also Albanians cooperate with Serbian NGOs from Niš or Belgrade or other bigger cities, but not in the region of Preševo or Bujanovac. Between Albanian and Serbian NGOs, there is no real, I would say, dynamics or cooperation, which is also in a way pushing the Albanian minority into some kind of segregation, and this is a real problem, I would say. And that makes this community really isolated, and none of the opposition parties, including are interested in the life of Albanian community only at the moment of the elections. And it's really strange enough that Albanian representatives in the parliament, together with some Bosniak, but Kamberi is one of the most outspoken parliamentarian in the Serbian parliament, and who is really a real voice of opposition. But unfortunately, he doesn't reach and doesn't make a difference in the parliament because they want to say that it is one party parliament of the progressive party. The other very, particular problem of Albanians in the south is recognition of diplomas of those who study in Kosovo, and most of the young people who do study in Kosovo, and which means that they cannot find jobs in those state and public institutions, and most of them leave. And this, of course, affects future elite of the community and reduces their potential to sort of get or achieve equality with the other side. And this is, I would say, one of the pending issues which is very serious. It started as of 2008 when Kosovo declared independence. Also, the Albanians who work abroad, and we met some of them in Medveđa especially, who would be willing to invest in their sort of hometowns, or there are some. This area has great potential for development, and unfortunately, throughout last decade, it was one of the most undeveloped regions, and this is the reason why many both Serbs and Albanians have left the region. Serbs were living for the bigger cities in Serbia, whereas Albanians were usually living for the Western Europe. And one, I would also like to underline that this facilization policies are not applying to Serbs who live abroad, and they can vote in the embassies abroad, while Albanians cannot. Once their passports expire, they get new passports, but with their addresses in Switzerland or in Belgium or wherever they live. So they apparently use this citizen status. And of course, the possibilities to get employment is also very much used, and this is also one of the reasons that younger people leave the region as well. And this is, I would say, a specific policy from Belgrade, which apparently is aiming at reducing the number of Albanians in the south. And of course, you can argue that Serbs are also leaving because of similar conditions, but they are not administratively discriminated. So this is really making a difference. So they are, and of course, Serbia also missed the opportunity to prosecute cases of murder, abuse, violence, and abduction of civilians in the period from 1996 to 2002, which would help regain the trust of the Albanian community. The Albanian community doesn't trust courts, doesn't trust police, doesn't trust anything that comes from Belgrade, and this is also creating, contributing to their segregation and isolation. And of course, it is in order to stop this, how to say, process of Albanians leaving the region, this facilitation process should be stopped, and the rights of those people should be restored. And judiciary should also be, and other institutions should be proportionally reflecting the actual number of Albanians. One other problem is that Albanians in the south didn't participate in census. So instead of the actual number, which is 70 or 80%, I don't know exactly how many of them are, they're only counted as 5%. So the money they get for the National Council, which is apparently the main institution, which is preserving the identity and is functioning as a very important institution, gets the money from the state only for the number of 5,000. So it's a very small portion of the money, of the budget they have at their disposal. So it's all these state administrative measures are apparently aimed at sort of stigmatizing Albanian community in the south. So it's I will stop here because there are many other things that one could say about the position of the Albanian community in the south. But one thing which I would underline or emphasize is that they should be treated equally as the Serbian community in the north. And that this should be taken up in the Brussels dialogue if it continues, because this is absolutely a similar situation. And there is no reason to sort of exclude them from this dialogue. Because unfortunately, Belgrade has managed so far to focus only on the Serbian community, which is okay. I mean, but it has to be reciprocal. And I think this is one of the main conditions for the dialogue to be successful is to be reciprocal and to be equal, to be on equal basis, not to appease to Belgrade because it is bigger, because it's more relevant internationally or regionally. I think this practice that was conducted so far by the mediators in this dialogue with Mogherini or now Lajčák should be somehow seized, and that it should be really on the performed on the equal basis, which would also cover the problems of Albanians and stuff. Okay. Here are some copies of this report that we had conducted 2 years ago, and if you're interested, you can have it. And I would also invite you to visit our site, both of the Helsinki Committee, but also this project Youth History, it's Youth Historia. You'll find many interesting articles on many topics that are relevant for understanding the dynamics in the region, but also to reflect on the future of the region. I think it can be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And in fact, in one of the classes that are here, they're assigned to read the U History website. So let me ask Ylbe to have Ylbe and then Alexander and Julieta
I hope we hear each other. I would speak on more broader sense about Albanian-Serbian relations, and I think the best place to talk about is Pristina, having in mind that the dynamism of those relations is more concentrated here, and I think the possible epilogue of the political sense of those relations might reflect on the entirety, the overall relations between Albanians and Serbs. And I think we have to bear in mind that when we talk about Albanian-Serbian relations, it's not just Kosovo and Albania, it's actually Albanians and Serbs are living in some 6 states in the region, and I will not include here diaspora and specific relations there. And out of those 6 states, 4 has emerged out of the disintegration of former Yugoslavia. So is it basically a relation that is shaping not just the relation of the 2 ethnicities, but I think the entire region. And in order to understand the complexity of these relations, we have to view it on different sections and to deconstruct it in order to understand how this interdynamism plays to different dimensions. And of course, it is historic relations. At least it goes 1.5 million back, and it involves the different dynamism within the different imperial constructions, from Byzantine to Ottoman, or the conflicts within, or the problems that emerged due to different political aspects in modernity, including 2 Balkan wars and 2 world wars. But people often do not realize that these relations were not just in the political history, they were having other dimensions. So people sometimes forget about the so-called phenomenon of voivodas of monasteries. They forget the relation between the canon, the Albanian customary law, and the canon of Sardushan, and their relations to the Byzantine canon law. Sometimes people also forget about the epics or the linguistic borrowings between the 2 ethnicities, or sometimes on purpose they forget that the liberator of Belgrade was so-called Kondo Albania. These relations are quite dynamic, and sometimes as much as the history of the Albanian-Serbian relations is important and interesting, I think sometimes the perceptions about that history is even more complex and interesting. And this brought me to the issue of historiography, and what Sonia mentioned. It is very important how to review those historic relations, because on the both sides there are a lot of stereotypes, mythization, and this is the way how it plays on the other grounds, on the grounds of interhuman relations and on the political aspect. So I will divide these relations into the historic context and the political one, which is mostly what all of us know, and there the possible section is the dialogue and possible negotiations and epilogue of those negotiations, and the non-political dimension, and which is also very important and sometimes viewed on the margins. But actually, this non-political aspect of this relation is also very important, and it involves human relations and communitarian, professional, academic and cultural, but also the business relations. And these relations, I believe, pretty much depend on these 2 other categories of relations: the historic, or the perception of the historic ones, and especially the political ones. And the political relations between Albanians and Serbs are basically depending on the issue of Kosovo. We have seen lately the more advantageous connections between Belgrade and Tirana. Recently, Albania have been seen as a possible touristic destination from Serbia. So these relations are moving on the parallel tracks, but everybody recognizes that the real issue is is the Kosovo. And until this aspect of tackling the Kosovo issue will not be resolved, I think the entire relations between Albanians and Serbs will be pending on that issue. But as we said, Albanians and Serbs are living in 6 countries around. They have to be, these relations is also reflecting on 2 other dimensions. It is on the regional issues directly to stability and maybe the perceivement of unfinished business due to the disintegration of former Yugoslavia. And the second, it plays a larger role on geopolitics, because keeping pending the issue of Kosovo means that you are keeping pending a lot of other geopolitical reflections between NATO and Eastern countries, between the relations of EU and Russia, and a lot of other aspects, because as much as Kosovo issue will be pending, and it will be in a sort of a frozen conflict or deadlock, it will be a perspective for reflection and messing up with a lot of non-Western actors who have been using it very recently on many dimensions. And let us think for a moment about the phenomenon of the fake news that recently has involved so much this region, and especially due to these pending issues that have been utilized politically on the special hybrid war. So Albanians and Serbs have to have in mind that their relations, please keep pending the other dimensions here around. And when Sonia mentioned the possibility that I talk about the Serbian community here, I had to add the special aspect of how this plays into the life of the Serbian community. And I think Serbian community here is absolutely scrutinized under the monopoly of the political Belgrade, who not just control the ordinary lives of the Serbs due to the different donations, different bureaucratic aspects, healthcare. It is also keeping them pending on the political aspects. And I think it was very important for President Vučić to build his own strategy of keeping the monopoly under the Kosovo Serbs, that later on was found in its instrument to control other Serbs in the region after the disintegration of the Yugoslavia. So-called Serbian world is not possible if you don't control the political infrastructure of the Serbs outside of Serbia. Actually, this is the tool, but this is very much a strategy that has been built. And unfortunately, it has been accepted and allowed by many in the Brussels dialogue, including international community, but also Kosovo elite, that have accepted promising of Vučić that in order to deliver the hard part of the dialogue, you need to control the political infrastructure of the Serbs in Kosovo. That's why I think the political authentic representation of Serbs have been sacrificed. And we don't have anybody that is still in the political life from those who have accepted the new reality in Kosovo. And even in the last elections, you can see that the higher turnout was from the Serbian community. They have won 8 or 9 mayors, and they are going to the second round for the 10th one. This monopoly directly controls the lives of the Serbs here, and it doesn't allow them to have a direct impact on their future. And maybe I would highlight here the momentum of how this interdynamism plays on the recent events in the north. I think it was the good news that the both communities were not victims of the official truth of what happened there, and they were not overreactions. And I think that was very important and a good sign that the people in the difficult momentum can think with their own head, and they will search for more truths, and they will try to search for more information tools in order to reach their point. This is why it is very important that these two dynamisms, the political aspects of the Serbian-Albanian relations, are not hijacked, are not under the monopoly, in order to allow the parallel complementary line of these relations that are non-political, and they will depend very much on each other. And until, let's say, the goodwill from the political elites is not found in terms of the dialogue, because I think there is different perceptions about the speed in Belgrade and Pristina, whether to reach some sort of a final status. I think it is very important that both sides, with the help of international community, into this sort of interregnum, find a proper pre-agreement that will mean that the both sides will not continue with the provocations that might reflect the security of these relations, but also security and stability of the region that will be misused by others. That both sides have to recognize the right of each other to pursue its own path of the political existence, and that the both sides should not obstacle and interrupt the European perspective. I would hesitate here to say Euro-Atlantic perspective, because there is a difference in the both sides. How do they perceive what is called Euro-Atlantic, but at least from the European perspective. And third, they have to recognize the continuation of the normality and functioning of institutions and the movement of people, movement of goods, and as much as possible, a normalization of these relations. This probably should include demonopolization of the different political structures, what Sonia just told us, blackmailing the Albanian community in the Preševo Valley, not allowing them to have a proper and functional administrative life, and same here. I think this is also very important because Albanians and Serbs are also as a pillar of the relations in the Balkans, of probably the biggest nations around. They have also obligations towards others. And probably this is the fourth point of that pre-agreement, that whatever the solution is reached on Kosovo, it should not have negative impact on the relations of others in terms of what we have seen as the proposals of the Janša paper or others that might, especially in this difficult geopolitical vacuum, might produce a negative long-term scenarios for others. This is just for the beginning. If you have questions, I am ready to answer on 3 languages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I have my precious memory from the student days. I like to be among students. And, I think we might be overwhelmed with this atmosphere of negativity. I traveled much around the Serbian and Albanian communities and around Kamenica, Serbian villages, and around Gnjilane. And my overall impression is that we, in terms of media and this scholarly representation and certainly on a political level, might be overwhelmed by this negative attitude. We thought I'm actually here representing the NGO from Novi Sad and Belgrade, Center for Historical Studies and Dialogue. So we try to combine scholarly research with the activistic approach to the trying to influence decision makers and so on. So we thought we might approach this issue from the reversed, let's say, from the opposite point, trying to find bits and pieces and sparkles of humanity and good relations and things that are actually functioning, and then to put all these instances and examples together, and then to go through the history of a relationship between Serbs and Albanians. And we've come up to the point to understand that the situation might not be as gloomy as we usually perceived. In Serbia, we have this diabolic synergy between the media, irresponsible media, ethnocentric political elites, and even mainstream historiography. And you have this mainstream current that seems to be invisible. You know, it's so difficult to fight these ethnic stereotypes. But then to come up with on the ordinary level, the level of ordinary people, and actually what we try to do is to find that the wrong perception is the perception of the political elites and even the university elites, and to find that actually the normality among the ordinary people. So we named our project Extraordinary, extra within the brackets, so extraordinary people, in terms that actually we find extraordinarity among the ordinary people, not among and we start doing interviews about this coexistence. But you know, when you say coexistence, it is also the tolerance. It seems as if you only tolerate somebody, but we find that this was much more than tolerating your neighbor. It was really living together in these communities, and you even come up to try to reconstruct the identity card in terms of what is identity information of Serbs, for instance, in Gnjilane region. You will see that they cannot construct their own identity without interaction of Albanians, because all the time some neighbor Albanian will be integrated in their own life accounts. They work together. For instance, they consider these things like an ordinary stuff. Like, he told me we help each other, but they wouldn't focus and tell us exactly how they helped each other. And then why? Because they think it is a normal thing. And then there was a guy, and we tried to interview him, and only after some time, because we wanted an exact example how they helped each other, and then he told me, well, I was a teenager during the war, and there was a Serbian military paramilitary in my neighborhood. So my personal obligation was to take my two Albanian friends each morning, to take them to the local grocery shop and to bring them back home, because I felt that they will be safe in this way. And you know, in the moment when there was a Serbian paramilitary or UÇK paramilitary coming to their villages, they tried to protect each other. They would guarantee for the honesty of their neighbors. They worked together, especially in the socialist period, and I could find even the most beautiful examples of what might be considered the most humanistic heritage of the Yugoslav socialist period. I find the bits of this even ideology, this brotherhood and unity among the older people, and that you could see that it was not an artificial to that extent, that they really that it was integrated somehow, that it was a genuine emotion. But on the other level, this good neighborhood relationship that we traced back into history. So we have this beautiful account in 1906, 1907, Serbian-Albanian BESA agreement, where within this old custom law practice, so to go behind the Ottoman institutions, they manage on their own micro environment to find a way of how to help each other, how to protect each other, how to arrange for what was considered by a Serbian consul in Pristina the most prosperous period for the Serbs of Gnjilane region in the beginning of 20th century. So our utopian idea was to have, for instance, history textbooks backed by such accounts, of not trying to falsify history. We know that the history of the animosity, of the hostile relations, of the violent interaction between Serbs and Albanians was very much present, perhaps dominant, and so on. But we thought in terms of what might be considered affirmative or helpful, or when you think about how to make a functional society, I think it's better to prove, to show this kind of interaction, positive interaction between people, how people actually manage to help each other, provide shelter to each other, especially in this moment of crisis, of the ethnic violence and so on. So this might not be a full representation of the overall relationship between Serbs and Albanians, but often when you take this heroic narrative in the history textbooks, you don't find heroes in these military terms, you don't find heroes on the total population, you find only a few examples, but these are also the several examples of good relationships, of good practices, of what might be considered as a healthy ground for mutual relationship between two communities. Of course, the state accountability should be on the high level. I spoke with people in Ranilu, it's a Serbian Jewish community in Gnjilane, and they told me that, you have people who fled Kosovo in 1999, and for something like 2 decades, their fields have not been used. Nobody actually worked on this agricultural land. And when it happened, so the guy told me from this village, if any Albanian would try to enter this arable land, and they call by mobile the local police, the police will appear within 2 or 3 hours. And I think this level of accountability should be maintained. On this level. So to have this very basic notion of security throughout Kosovo, I think those episodes of, we have this concentration of violence in what was going on with Serbian paramilitary during the war, during the conflict. Then we had this horrible violent episode of the 2004 March pogrom against the remaining enclaves of Serbs. So these 2 episodes are actually, and we are now talking about people who have a clear memory of, it's not a distant memory. So it is a difficult issue actually to build this mutual mutual relationship and trust in Kosovo. And I would say it's not only a matter of the state recognition. This is what I often say. You may even recognize, Serbia and Kosovo might even recognize each other, but if we will still have this level of ugly, poisonous, ethnocentric stereotypes in public speech, in media, in tabloid media, by political elites, we will not do anything. And actually, what we are trying to do is dealing is tackling this issue on the level of academia and also on the activistic level. We think that the very beginning is of this mutual trust is actually the language, the very language that was spoiled in this bloody 8th session of the Central Committee of the Serbian Party in the 1980s. So that was actually the moment when on the level of the Serbian political elites, Albanians start being again perceived on the level they were in, let's say, the end of the 19th century, beginning 20th century, when highly ranked Serbian politicians said, this is the moment when we figure out that Dmitry Tucovic was not right about Albanians. He was not right about Albanians. They are actually this enemy factor, that we should have this hostile attitude against them. So actually, as a student, I like much more to have interaction. So I will not make any conclusion. My conclusion will be to have a good conversation with you. Thank you so much, and I enjoy so much being in Kosovo.
Thank you, Alex. Julieta, and really, please, the microphone.
Thank you very much. I am so pleased to be here among you students of RIT, together with Sonia for a long time. We had served as board members, so we really were very much into improving the lives of you students of RIT, former AUK. So it is a very important part, AUK is very important part of my life, because I was also one of 3 individuals that established this institution. Today, I would like to talk about the process of the dialogue, why the dialogue is so important, not only for the lives of Kosovo, Albanians in Kosovo and Serbs in Kosovo, but also, as Ilber mentioned earlier, the importance of the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia for the lives of all the peoples in the region of the Balkans. You all remember, and I believe from a particular view, you have studied the ICJ advisory opinion on Kosovo, and all the news after the advisory opinion was issued. From one point of view, the advisory opinion was not important at all, because it's not a binding document, and who cares how many advisory opinions ICJ would issue. On the other hand, scholars especially know that advisory opinions are equally important for the development of international law. And also, it is a well-known thing that the advisory opinion on Kosovo, even though it has not maybe developed international law in general, because scholars expected at least to say something more about self-determination and secession, and especially so-called remedial secession, a new thing that we all expect that one day would be an important component of international law. However, as far as Kosovo is concerned, advisory opinion of ICJ does have an important role, because you do not look at the document as an isolated document, but also how the document, the advisory opinion, was received by other organs of UN. And the General Assembly of UN is important, plays particularly important role in this case, because not only that with the request, of course, of Serbia, but through General Assembly of UN, advisory opinion was issued. However, it is important for the influence that that advisory opinion would make in our lives and the lives of the Europe itself, is the fact that after the opinion was issued, the UN General Assembly acknowledged it, accepted it by consensus, and also the draft resolution for accepting the ICJ opinion on Kosovo was co-drafted by Serbia and European Union. So the resolution that was drafted by these two parties was accepted by consensus, which means that all members of UN accepted that resolution. What the resolution says and how we have forgotten about it. First, the resolution acknowledges the ICJ opinion on Kosovo, which clearly says that the declaration of independence is in accordance with international law. But the second important thing is that UN General Assembly requires both parties and emphasizes both parties as equal parties by, of course, not emphasizing whether Kosovo is a state or it's not a state, but General Assembly resolution speaks of two parties, the necessity of establishing a dialogue that is facilitated by EU. So we have the result of the dialogue would be establishing a clear path towards EU for both parties. And the third important component of the UN General Resolution was that the result of this dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia would be improvement of the lives of the peoples. This means what happened afterwards, of course, EU started in a prompt way to establish the framework for the dialogue. First, we had the technical dialogue, and afterwards it developed into a political dialogue. But the end result, the first comprehensive agreement, now the whole issue deteriorated a little bit because it was officially named as Pristina-Belgrade or Belgrade-Pristina dialogue and not Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, even though by UN, it was UN General Assembly, and I'm emphasizing again, which was approved by consensus. It was named as Kosovo and Serbia dialogue, a dialogue between two equal parties. The dialogue was not supposed to be focused on internal arrangements of Kosovo, both political and constitutional arrangements. But the focus of dialogue would have been relations between two parties, which means that the minorities living in Serbia, especially because of the mechanisms towards EU, should have never been neglected. This is why, even though it is an international agreement and we are bound by it, it has features and it was considered a big improvement in 2013. However, the topic of the discussion was Kosovo. The object of the discussion was Kosovo. Instead, the improvement of the lives of people of both countries, and furthermore, of the countries in the region. So this was one important issue that has been forgotten since 2010 until now, and especially with this important agreement of 2013. Now, we all know that we do have special power sharing mechanisms established in Kosovo through our constitution that were developed and envisioned by the Ahtisaari proposal, Ahtisaari plan. And it is part of our constitutional law. It is part of the overall arrangement of our independent Kosovo as an independent state and country. The second important thing is that EU somehow deviated, even though it was a big success, the agreement of 2013, deviated by not accepting fully all the principles of rule of law in this agreement, which affects in a very brutal way the overall arrangement of constitutional arrangements in Kosovo as a rule of law and country and constitutional law democracy. How it does? First, it infringes European Convention on Human Rights, which is part of Kosovo constitution, but also is part of constitutional arrangement of Serbia. And the second thing, the power sharing mechanisms envisioned in the constitution of Kosovo, which derives from Ahtisaari plan, makes these mechanisms dependent, or functioning of these mechanisms depending from Belgrade and not depending on institutional arrangement of Kosovo. So how does it look nowadays, and what we should expect in the future, and why the dialogue went wrong, and now we all consider that it is the fault of maybe only EU, and especially some personalities within, that had powerful positions within EU, such as Mogherini. Everything was stuck because leaders in Kosovo and leaders in Serbia were not ready to implement the agreements as far as they were in compliance with EU acquis communautaire, for one reason only, because both countries had leaders that were not ready to establish the rule of law in their own countries. And if you have leaders that are not committed to rule of law, you cannot expect to have proper dialogue that will improve the lives of the people. For example, immediately after the 2013 agreement, we had a problem because our government fell. How it happened, even though we had pretty stable government at that time, because the ruling political party was not, did not consider itself legitimate enough to continue with the implementation of 2013 agreement. What happened the second thing? Things went further. We had the new government with all political crisis, and the political crisis, if you could imagine in Kosovo, if you could recall in Kosovo, usually are considered or are viewed as a constitutional crisis. In reality, we have never had real and serious constitutional crisis. We had political crisis that our leadership was not able to resolve as political issues, but because they were so afraid to deal with them, they immediately found as a resort constitutional court in order to make a different body, non-political body, deal with political issues. And you can all remember the problem with the 2015 agreement on the association of Serb communities. I would like to mention something else and see something that looks like and it is part of the rule of law that was never implemented in Kosovo, even though Kosovo is considered as a country that has implemented at least the judgments of the Constitutional Court. Even though we have experienced great public frustration when Constitutional Court issued judgment, but we never questioned whether we are going to implement those judgments or not. It is, in fact, there are two judgments of the Constitutional Court that the political forces in Kosovo, since the judgment was issued, were resolved not to implement. And one, it is very much political sensitive judgment, is the judgment on the Dečani monastery. There are people that might consider that the judgment was very much in contradiction with the Constitutional Court, with the Constitution of Kosovo. And there are others that consider the judgment that is a judgment that deals with the basic individual rights, respectively religious rights. On the other hand, and I would like to see whether you have questions on this topic. On the other hand, we are the only country in the region that has never ever been able to adopt a law on religious organizations. We do have a constitution that is very good as far as, and one of the best constitutions as far as individual rights are concerned and religious liberties are concerned. However, we have never been able, neither during UNMIK time nor after the independence, to adopt a law on religious organizations, because you cannot have religious rights if you cannot establish religious organizations. So we have somehow violations of religious rights in both ways. One, we do not implement the judgment of the Constitutional Court regarding the Dečani monastery, and I'm looking right now only as an important feature of exercising religious rights by the Serbs, even though it has many more components. And on the other hand, we do not, the power sharing mechanisms that we have regarding the rights of minority communities here are being used for not allowing now everybody else enjoy religious rights, because Serbs are those that are blocking and has done it for several times, blocking the adoption of the law on religious organizations. So you see how both countries, even though are supposed to work through the dialogue with the facilitation of EU to improve lives of everybody, in reality are using all possible means, including power sharing mechanisms, to violate the most basic rights of individuals and communities here. I would stop now,
Okay, thank you.
and I invite you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Questions.
First, we'll have Mr. Petsi, who I introduced earlier, to speak, and then we can take questions. And so, thank you. Really. Make sure you use the microphone.
Yes, it is, I guess. Yes.
Perhaps both.
Like Russia.
Double barrel.
United Nations. Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you very much for the invitation. Sonia and Alexander, welcome to Pristina. Such a pleasure meeting you after quite some time. Yes, 2 years. And my dear friend Julieta and Ilber. Dear friends, I'm very happy to be here with you today. I would like to talk about something a bit slightly different from those that I have heard until I came. But I'm going to talk about different styles of nationalism of Albanians and Serbs. And I think that this is fundamental to understand the current dynamics in Kosovo and in the region, and what might happen in the future as well. Serbian nationalism is centralized. And it was like this since the very creation of the Serbian state. Initially, Serbian interest, when the state was created and formally recognized in 1878, until then, and until the Anschluss of Bosnia and Herzegovina by Austro-Hungarian Empire, the interest of Belgrade was not on Kosovo, not on the southern part. It was focused on Bosnia and Herzegovina. But when Austro-Hungary took it, then things have changed. And so it was the battle, or what it is called by the then Serbian elite, the old Serbia, or Stara Serbia, meaning Kosovo and Macedonia. On the other side, and until then, relations between Albanians and Serbs in general were pretty good. From 1878 and on, situation started to deteriorate with different amplitudes of being better or getting worse. Albanian nationalism on the other side is quite archaic, decentralized, and anarchic. Why anarchic? Because Albanian nationalism has not a capital. Never Tirana could command Pristina what to do, nor Pristina could command Tirana what to do. Even Pristina and Tirana could not tell very much and Albanians in Macedonia what to do, or even those in Preševo Valley. Why is this phenomenon? The key question is why? Because it is, first and foremost, it is because of the late Albanian nationalism, very weak Albania when it has been established. And all of this continued to be a fact even and during the 90s. For example, while in the beginning of 90s, the Republika Srpska Krajina and Republika Srpska were creations of Milošević and supported by Milošević with weapons, finances, and what went with it. Yeah. The project of independence of Kosovo started basically in 1988, 1989, 1990. And at that time, Albania was a very big, poor, and isolated country still under communist regime. So the project of independence of Kosovo was not generated in Albania. Even Enver Hoxha was against it, against the very idea of Republic of Kosovo, and he was against it because he thought that if Kosovo would become a republic, then this could endanger his position in Albania. This is what archives right now are telling. And because in Kosovo, Kosovo could become a hub for diaspora, anti-Enverist diaspora, and this could endanger also his regime. During the 90s, I'm gonna tell you a bit about what it means to be aligned fully or to be dependent fully on a single pole like Serbs in Republika Srpska Krajina or in Republika Srpska, they're from Serbia. So when you have a single pole, that pole does not let smaller poles or sub-poles on ethnic basis to have their own autonomy, because they have to act according to the interest of Serbia in this case. If not, they can be abandoned. And if they are abandoned, they cannot make alliances with the others. So this is a very delicate dilemma for this kind of relations, and which can produce also tragedies and can create false hopes that an ethnicity, a group of people of the same ethnicity like the other pole who are living in a different state, that they will have unconditional support of their patron pole, whatever they do. But this is not the case. We know very well that in 1995, when Operation Storm or Oluja happened in Croatia, Milosevic simply abandoned Serbs in Croatia. And he was ready also to abandon Serbs in Republika Srpska because his own interests were threatened. And within few days, 250,000 Serbs had to leave Croatia and to come to Serbia as refugees. On the other side, when it comes to, I'm just trying to illustrate this, and I will come to the current point. On the other side, there were few moments during the 90s when Albania practically abandoned Kosovo. First, it has been done by Sali Berisha, who said that Kosovo is an issue of human rights in Yugoslavia, trying to paraphrase him, and Fatos Nano then in 1997, who said that, okay, Kosovo is an internal issue of Serbia. But politically, Kosovo was somehow abandoned, and especially in 1996 and 7, it's too much to talk about it. But our leadership here continued the path towards the independence of Kosovo, regardless what Tirana was saying. And why this happened? Because Kosovars here, Albanians in Kosovo, were not dependent neither financially, not politically by Albania, not militarily. If Kosovars would have been dependent by Albania, we would have had a totally different story. Then the fate of Kosovo could have been decided in Tirana very easily. And maybe the people here very easily could not have enjoyed independence. Because because in that case, we could have been subordinated to the major interests of Tirana, which are not automatically the same with the interest of Kosovo. And okay, here we are today. We are in a situation in which the idea of centralized nationalism in Serbia has not died. Ilber mentioned Serbian world. It is the continuation of that concept. And Lista Srpska in Kosovo, obviously it is an instrument of that policy. But we have to have in mind one thing, that nowadays it is very difficult to be a member of Serbian community in Kosovo. It's very difficult because our compatriots, Serbs in Kosovo, are oppressed by Serbia through Serbian list. Even the protesters whom we have seen on TV 3 weeks ago, close to border passing in Brnjak and Jarinje, those people have been sent there by force, and majority of them were teachers, were medical workers.
Those who are paid.
Yes, and they have been threatened that if they don't go there, they will lose their job. We have to put ourselves in their shoes and to understand their position. On the other side, Albanians in Kosovo don't understand another thing, which is quite important, and it is the role of Orthodox Church for Serbian identity. This lack of understanding somehow is justifiable by Albanians because Albanian nationalism is secular. It's not based on religion. But Serbian nationalism was and is heavily based on religion. And we have to understand these differences. And what, for example, and when we come here right now to the case of monastery of Dečane, I think that it was a big mistake, and it is a big mistake that that decision is not implemented until now. Why? Because this decision, the lack of implementation of, without implementing that decision, and as long as we delay its implementation, that large will be the gap of building trust between Albanians and Serbs in Kosovo, and we have to understand it. But many politicians do not understand it. Even people do not understand it. So in the end, I think that Albanians and Serbs in general do have two choices: to remain eternal enemies, or to project their future as allies, as future allies. If we want both of us to become part of or members of EU, automatically we will become allies, because it is a non-military alliance with some military component there. If not, we can live in isolation, and most probably we will continue to live in this way. And in the end of the day, who will suffer the most? People are going to suffer the most, because there will not be prosperity. Most of youngsters will look for finding ways to emigrate in Western countries to find a better future there. And so this is more or less how I project the future in the case if we don't have a dignified agreement between two countries. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lily. I have to say, this has been a really interesting and diverse discussion where different people in our panel have kind of focused on different things, some kind of micro things, some more macro issues. Some I think Julieta did both in her very succinct talk. And I just wanted to say that from what I gathered just really quickly is that there's a lot of blame and a lot of credit to go around when we look at both governments of both countries. And I think that it would be, and I think that this is a very, a good place to start for questions that any of you might have concerning the discussion. Just, where's the microphone?
I have a question to ask to Mr. Alexander. As you may have seen in the United States in the past few years, there's a movement to, let's say, switch, let's say, offensive monuments or statues in the United States south, well, let's say monuments of, let's say, slaveholders, for people who advocated for slavery with monuments which promote goodwill. Do you think that, let's say, the same movement should be applied, in Kosovo and in Serbia? Let's take, for example, the monument of Gazinostan, which is central to Serbian ethnocentrism. Like, do you think that, let's say, hypothetically, should be replaced by a monument which promotes goodwill, like the example you gave between Serbian and Albanian Vesta in 1906?
Thank you so much. Actually, on behalf of my organization and in a sort of a joint project with the municipality of Kamenica, we planted a tree to commemorate this Albanian-Serbian BESA agreement from 1906, 1907. But regarding the memorialization policy in Kosovo, I have to say that I was very saddened by the fate of much of memorial legacy of the anti-fascist period, socialist period. For Landovica, close to prison, this beautiful monument commemorating this friendship between Boro Vukmirovic and Goran and Ramis. I still have it in my mind, this beauty of the landscape and this memorial complex that really suits the environment and capture this moment. This is actually what we would try to promote. And we understand that these all layers of what was going on throughout 1980s, 1990, and then this violent conflict. And we know that place they replaced it with a monument dedicated to Učaka. I don't know either leaders or the combatants who died at the spot. I think also it's not. I didn't feel comfortable when I saw that in Pristina they had this double monument of Boro and Ramis, and then Boro's head was actually smashed and destroyed, and this also commemorated this idea, this notion of it is, to me, it is a bit strange to use this word tolerance. It is as if you only tolerate somebody. Or this coexistence, it is as if you're only living together but never had any interaction. You only coexist.
Khrushchev defined coexistence, and that was the period where he said it's competition short of war. That's how he described coexistence between the United States and the Soviet Union.
So what we witnessed, and it might not be a representative sample, but what we witnessed, for instance, I don't know, in Kosovo Albanians, they call it Binac Morava, this region around Kamenica and Gnjilane, and we are moving now towards Strpce, And you know, for this joint protest against mini hydro power plants, where both Albanians and Serbs were taking place together with Albanian and Serbian banners. I think it's really a nice representation of what might Kosovo prove to be in the future. And even in the same villages in Strpce region, during this violent episode 2004, these people gathered together and they made, again, in their own microenvironment, they decided that they will protect each other. They will not allow anyone from outside to come and to harass anybody. So in these terms, my position is easy position. I'm defending an issue of ordinary people. I don't like our states. I don't like our political elites. At some level, this what I'm telling you might be an anarchistic. I don't believe in Serbia you will find a political elite to recognize Kosovo, not in the current government, not even in opposition. In the opposition parties, you will find even the stauncher supporters against such. And for that reason, I really think that the accountability of the Kosovo state should be proven at each and single case whenever some human rights of any individual will be come into question. And also on this level of representation and level of the scholarly or the media or the historiography, I think this what we are proposing is the focusing on the positive examples of coexistence. I would like to have some of these beautiful monuments from the socialist era to be somehow reconstructed, or maybe, but this is up to you. I'm not from Kosovo. This is your own responsibility. You should build your community on your own, but you should know that this is a mission impossible if you don't do it together.
Thank you, Alex. Question, maybe. Just wait till the microphone.
Hi everyone, thank you for your presentation. I got a question for Mr. Alexander and also a comment for Mr. Yudzinpeci. First, a question for Mr. Alexander is that you mentioned 2 cases of friendship here between Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo. But as the dialogue is going on, I think also the Preševa and Bujanov's case will be included there. So what are Serbs doing about the Preševa people and also Bujanov's? Because in my opinion, what is happening there is a political eviction, because people there don't have work. They come here in Kosovo to study, and also they go in diaspora to work. So for some years, the Preševa and Bujanovci will be without Albanians. It's kind of political evaction. And for Yudzinpeci, if we talk about the relationships between Kosovo and Albania during war, also we should take care, because we know the role of Albania in the Kosovo War, and how the first teams of KLA trained there, and also their help they did to us. So I think we should take care. Thank you.
May I? So let me clarify. No, I took care very much about what I was talking. The trainings and whatever happened in Albania were not sufficient to provide assistance in order to change the fate of the war in Kosovo. It was pretty symbolic, very small. We can train some 100 people, but to win a war, it's something else. Let me continue with this. The key point here was that in 1991, Kosovo refused to take weapons from Albania because a clear message came from US administration that if Kosovars would enter in the war, they should take responsibility for it, and that the number of victims could go beyond 300,000 people. But it is something else to help you on something, and it is completely different to depend on somebody. Kosovo was not dependent on Albania. We got assistance, but we were not dependent. Because in the end of the day, when the war erupted in Kosovo, the weapons have been bought by our money. So that's it. So we have to make a distinction between assistance and dependence.
One more thing.
Yes.
Already in 1992 and 3, Americans interfered in the Kosovo matters by warning Belgrade that they would be punished if they start anything in Kosovo. And the main reason for that was that they were afraid that the conflict would spill over to Macedonia. So Macedonia is the only relevant geopolitical location in the Balkans, which Americans cared about because of everything that the conflict would imply there. So since as of 92 Christmas,
yes,
morning,
Christmas
Kosovo was really unable to get seriously any help from Albania or anyone else. And it continued to be so until 1996 when Macedonian president recognized Taiwan, and China withdrew its support for the resolution, which apparently was about the troops which were deployed in Macedonia in 1993. So, and it really, Kosovo conflict cannot be understood, or the intervention, NATO intervention cannot be understood without having this wider, larger context, which includes also Macedonia. So it's not only about Kosovo, it's about the southern wing of the NATO.
Absolutely.
It's not possible only to talk about Kosovo.
And if I may add something, by the end of 1991, the National Security Council, of United States, Sandy Berger was head of National Security Council at the time. This institution, which advises President of US on security matters, has designed 2 strategies for the Balkans. The first one was about the conflict in the north, in Bosnia and Croatia. And the strategy that has been put in place by them was the exhausting strategy. So we will intervene there where all parties are exhausted. The main aim for the conflict in the north was to contain and isolate the conflict in order not to be spread in the south. When it came to, and the Christmas warning was exactly what Sonia said. It was about spreading of conflict from Kosovo to Macedonia, then Bulgaria and Albania and Serbia would jump, and Greece, and in the end, Turkey. And this would endanger the southern flank of NATO. And that's why this is the logic why the Christmas warning came, and it was not exactly because of Kosovo, but we got some benefits out of it.
This is the point that Uber made in his comment about the geopolitical dimension, that was always present.
O mene su pitali, da, ali ja zaista nisam ekspert.
Can I add something?
Ali imamo obavezu da mu odgovorim, tako da ću mu reći nešto.
Hoćeš ti ili?
Ajde vi ste formalni.
I just wanted to go into the very interesting question that the gentleman made here in your reply, which is why we do not establish a proper parallel project and we have a joint project in which both sides will benefit. And the way I understood Mr. Alexander is that sometimes you cannot expect the same reasoning from one elite that is in Serbia. And that implies very fashionable thing these days in Kosovo, that is reciprocity. And sometimes people do forget that reciprocity is not the goal. Reciprocity is only the instrument to reach the goal. Because reciprocity can bring you a win-win scheme, but it can bring you also lose-lose scheme. Because if you do me a harm, I will harm you. What Mr. Milicic was suggesting, in my understanding, was that for Kosovo it's very important to do unilaterally positive step, not just because of the Serbia, but because of its image, because of the life of own people, and because it can send a positive signal. And I think definitely Kosovo needs that. So this is the way I understood this dynamism and relationship. And sometimes I think absolutely is misunderstood and misguided the reciprocity that we find so fashionable these days in Kosovo.
Okay, and I would like only to point out, so you mentioned that we do have two examples. So we have something like 40 and something interview accounts. It's live accounts of both Serbs and Albanians. A kind of testimony of how they could manage to build life in their own micro level, how you could see that the things are actually functioning. And not only in some artificial terms, but in terms of the everyday life, in terms of establishing normal activities of the small community, and this genuine notion where they don't even consider that this is something extraordinary. They don't think it is exceptional. So this was the level that I was amazed by. And regarding Preševo, I've never been there. I don't believe official statistics. As I told you, I don't like our states. I'd like to go there on the micro level again to speak with the ordinary people, and then to come up to this level to be able to judge. What I can tell you is that this guy, Mr. Kamberi, really gained the prominence in Serbian public. He was, I think that we shared by social networks, his expose in the parliament was probably the best expose of not only that day, that month. I think this was something like the best expose we heard on any ground of this opposition of the human rights or whatever might be considered the positive affirmative accounts that you might heard in the Serbian parliament. And I take his complaints about this lack of finding employment of the Albanians in local authorities, in central authorities, and so on. And I recall that he was answered by the representative of government, and they told them that there is a quota for the Albanians, but allegedly they don't speak official language. But this is really a huge problem, and this is what I actually witnessed in the Kamenica region, that wherever you have people who could speak actually to the languages of the both communities, that this was actually the way of providing this very basic, healthy ground for them to be involved in joint projects. And it was magnificent for me to enter the municipality of Kamenica and to hear Serbian at one spot and Albanian on the other spot. And then I entered one guy and I asked him, where did you learn Albanian so good? So in order to be able to speak, but he told me, well, I am Albanian. And I thought he was Serb, because his Serbian was beautiful. It was even in literary terms, it was very, very good language. But this is again, perhaps at this level, a utopian perspective, but it should be given a bit more prominence in the public. This is what we should also take into account, not only this gloomy perspective. And I don't believe that things might be solved at this level of the political accountability of our political elites. But I think under the pressure of the international community, we might come up to this situation, so not to have any problems on the local, on the micro level, so that people could travel, that no one will harass them on this border crossing. And what is more important is this perspective that we will actually eventually enter the European Union, because I think under that perspective, this stupid little game with building up identities and protecting some imaginary borders, or these administrative borders, or the state borders, it will be completely meaningless. But if we enter the European Union, then there will be no need to make this demarcation line.
This is far-fetched.
If I could just follow on with what Mr. Milicic just said, I would say, there's a kind of one of the great books by Malcolm Gladwell. It's called like Tipping Point and the Wisdom of Crowds. He's written many great books. And so often in the public discourse about relations between Serbs and Albanians, it focuses on great things, great institutions, and supposedly great men who may or may not be great. And in fact, and then it's really easy to just say, to denigrate the capacity of small little projects, of small little things, but at the end of the day, if you're talking about improving relations between two communities, it's not just talking to the two leaders. This has to happen in a granular way, on the ground, the kind of projects that Alexander is participating in. And the fact that there should be more of this kind of contact and more of these kinds of efforts to kind of reach out and to find areas of common interest, common concern, and to work together. And so that, clearly, in the absence of an agreement, a high-level agreement, then this kind of granular people-to-people kind of process will not be successful. But in the absence of the people-to-people process, the kind of the high-level agreements will be hollow and will not really be filled with anything. So that's my little addition to all this.
When we had this fact-finding mission in Kosovo, interviewing people in the Serb communities, both north and south, we heard many stories of their mutual communication in many fields, especially in medical sphere. So they do trust Albanian doctors, and Albanians do trust Serbian doctors, and the Kosovska Mitrovica is especially exemplary for that. But also you have many Albanians coming to Belgrade for medical services. Of course, Skopje, Istanbul, but also Belgrade, especially children. It was practiced from long before. So there are many opportunities on this daily life that will be more exposed to the public through media. So it goes on also for us in Serbia, not relating only to Albanians, but other positive things which are never exploited as something to show that people can communicate on different levels. So I think media has important responsibility to carry on such, stories, to air them, to sort of really get through to the communities, both communities. And this is lacking, I would say.
Indeed. Is there a microphone to?
I have a question about Ms. Moshkule, since you addressed a very crucial point about our future's dialogue and our future's country. I want to ask, what do you think our government is addressing enough about this dialogue? Because we know different governments have different platforms for dialogue, and what do you think would be as a final agreement between two countries, in your opinion? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Of course, I cannot predict, but I do believe that the present government is more ready, actually, to take part and conclude this process of dialogue as it was envisioned in the very beginning. For the first time, now we are discussing the issue of the dialogue as the dialogue between two countries, with the object of the dialogue improving lives of the peoples of two countries. Earlier, the difference was that the dialogue was considered as a dialogue between two elites, but the object of the dialogue was deviated. The object of the dialogue was Kosovo itself, which was never true, at least not true when EU took the assignment from UN General Assembly to facilitate the dialogue between two parties. I actually do agree with many things that were said, but the issue of reciprocity, of course, it is a means for achieving the overall agreement with Serbia. However, reciprocity means improving lives, putting the dialogue in the right path. Reciprocity means improving lives of the people of both countries, improving lives also of people in Preševa Valley, because the administrative means for cleansing that area, it is a vehicle for ruining trust between the people of two countries. So I believe if there are no other obstacles, at least this new government is putting the dialogue in the right path. And the reason, I believe, is not that the people, individuals consisting this new government we have here in Kosovo are cleverer than individuals earlier. But individuals consisting this new government here do not have interest in violating individual rights, and their interest is establishing the rule of law, which was not the case earlier. Thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions. There's someone back there who is hand up before.
Go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. I have a question for whoever wants to answer. Do you think the fact that Miroslav Dajčak and Josip Borrell both dealing with Kosovo dialogue, Kosovo and Serbia dialogue, is, I think it's interesting because both Dajčak and Borrell were ministers of foreign affairs of Slovakia and Spain during a time where both those states were opposing Kosovo status. They were ministers of foreign affairs during that time. Do you think it makes them biased?
Well, since I'm somebody who have been taking part in many negotiations, and but Mr. Ahtisaari definitely was not from non-recognizing states. Well, that's the case of reciprocity. What do we do if Mr. Borrell and Dajčak cannot recognize Kosovo? We do not enter dialogue, or we do not recognize their countries, Slovakia and Spain. That was my point. Reciprocity means interdependence. You can pursue your own path sometimes because you have a need, you have a value that you want to pursue, and this is like that. Of course, it is not fair because these are two non-recognizing countries, and it prejudges the position of the two sides. But as much as it a minus, it is also a plus because Mr. Lajcak and Mr. Borrell will oblige their own states to think of us. So it is disadvantage, but as everything, it is also advantage the way you can approach it. So through Mr. Borrell, through Mr. Lajcak, we can address their own countries because probably their media will be more interested if Mr. Lajcak is running the business or if Mr. Borrell is running the business. Maybe we can use their media in Spain and ask Mr. Borrell, what does he think of that? Is he disadvantaged? Or what Mr. Lajcak thinks about that? So yes, principally it is negative position, but as everything else is a chance. And we have the interest to demonstrate our interest in using those disadvantages to create into own advantages. Because of the size of our country, because of the newborn of our country, because of the complexity of our relations, and because they represent EU. So yes, probably we should stress that disadvantage, but I think we should work to create it an own advantage.
Okay, good.
So I have two questions. The first question is directed to Mr. Alexander. I wanted to ask him if the fact that he has never been to Prussia to make these micro, questions to the civilians, Albanian civilians there, doesn't make you biased. And the second question is to Mr. Winter. So you continuously stated that Albanians should feel for the Serbians here because they are abandoned in a way from the Serbian government. But what about Albanians in Serbia? Like,
Didn't catch.
You continuously mentioned how the Albanians here should feel about the Serbians, should feel empathy about the Serbians here. But what about the Albanians in Serbia? Like we know that Serbians here have like every right. They are equal in every aspect with every Albanian. Like we have Serbian policemen, we have Serbian RTK has an actual channel about minorities.
I know it by heart.
Yes.
Yes. So, yeah.
So what about the Albanians in Serbia? I'm not trying to be a nationalist here, but I'm just saying, what about them? Should Serbians there feel about Albanians in Serbia? Thank you.
By not being to Russia actually makes me an ignorant for the situation in Russia, and that's why I cannot. That's why I cannot provide you with a specific answer. I told you only what I heard from media, and I heard you what was the argument by Mr. Kamberi and what was the argument by the Serbian authorities. And I don't judge in between. I should familiar myself with the local situation, and then I could provide you with the answer. And otherwise, as an ignorant in terms of the situation in Prussia, I cannot comment it.
Yes, it was quite some time ago when some top politicians in Kosovo have thought how to create some problems or to engage Albanians in Preševo Valley for the benefits of Kosovo. My advice was very simple. Don't put them into this game because we will just create victims out of them. We cannot provide substantial support for their protection, okay? So first things first. Then let's go to the next step. If I think that every citizen who lives in every country, regardless of that country, the name of that country, should feel accommodated and happy there. If not, then something is not okay with the state. In this case, something is rotten in Serbia, obviously, regarding the situation of Albanians in Preševo Valley, and you are reading, everybody's reading what is happening there. What makes me frustrated, actually, it is the lack of reaction by international community. By trying to silence this problem, they are aggregating it, and I'm not excluding maybe in the future we might have clashes or who knows what. But what frustrates me more than Serbia in this case, it is European Union and US.
They're very present there.
Yes. So this is my answer about it. Okay, I know that something is rotten there, but I'm very much frustrated with the US and EU and the lack of their reaction.
And they have OSCE mission down there as well.
Yeah.
Big sort of traveling every day to all these Albanian villages. He is reporting on it. And he apparently, we talked to him when we were there 2 years ago, there are no incidents on that. So for example, in Serbian perception, Trnovo is perceived as a hub of organized crime, drugs, and so on. But in reality, it's not so. You have heavy presence of Serbian police marching around, and it's a small place. And, in our imagination, it seems a big city of I don't know how many citizens there, but it's almost a small village. We went through and sat in a local restaurant. So it's not considered even by international organization which is following the global crime. It's not considered to be of relevance. In Serbia itself, there are other places. So it's, and then legal framework for minorities in Serbia is also in place, mostly according to the European standards. But the problem is that in practice you don't have implementation. You don't have this social, political atmosphere for Albanians, or, for example, Bosniak community in Sandžak to feel equal in the Serbian society. They're not integrated, not only in political life, but also not in the cultural, economic life. So it's a matter of an attitude which has been created over the last 3 decades, because Milosevic's, how should I say, approach to Albanians, it's still there. Nothing has changed in the meantime. We are still living under this, I would say, curse of Milosevic's propaganda, which is continued by Vučić and others. You don't have a positive story from Preševo or Kosovo. So the media on a daily basis demonizes Kosovo as a terrorist state, as a mafia state, and whatnot. And it spill over to Preševo and the Albanians living in the Preševo Valley. So it's a stigmatization which is continuous. So it's, and without the state being prepared, not only to implement its laws, strategies, and so on, but being prepared to create this positive atmosphere, to sort of rule out this toxic, I would say, everyday language from all media. And for example, of recent, you have very active radical groups in South Serbia, Misha Vacic and others who are there for the elections and so on. Even Vučić went to Bujanovac and Medveđa in the wake of the election down there. And they say it's a Serbian sort of municipality, whereas it was very mixed community before 90s, and now you have only 400 registered Albanians. That's how this is official number of Serbian authorities.
So we've come pretty much, I think, to the end. And I want to thank Sonia, Louis, Alexandra, Julieta, and Ülbe, because it's rare that we have such an amazing group. And I really use the term amazing because what we have friends and colleagues from Serbia with friends and colleagues from Kosovo. And it's not, and they really are, often you say, well, I want to respond to my friend. They say this in the US Senate, and they're really not friends, but they really are. And it's a demonstration that these kind of relations can take place. There's lots of disagreement, I know, because I know all of these people. I know not everyone agrees on every issue, but that's part of what a healthy kind of discourse amounts to. And I think that it's interesting here at the American University, or RIT Kosovo, that we once again have an example of critical thinking that is questioning of assumptions and thinking through creative ways of moving forward. And so that we've heard views of a particular Serbia that is very vital here in this meeting today. It's not just the view that you hear trumpeted on television all the time, but it's a view of many people, and it's not necessarily, and it's there and it's alive. And we've also heard really, I think, healthy and critical and very interesting views from our friends from Kosovo. So, and I'd say that the issue, as we talked about, as it was talked about by the panel, there are many smaller things, many little details. There is recognition of diplomas, license plates, all that sorts of things. It's also about really positive things of people finding common interests, of thinking about how to think about the past in a way that we can both, and that serves all of our interests. It serves the interests of us as individuals, not just as members of a particular ethnic community, because we are all not just members of ethnic communities. We are all many different things. We have different professions. We have, we're from different cities. We have different religions. And so all of these are different kinds of identities that we have. And when you're an individual, you have all of those identities. If you become simply one thing, then you may lose some of those identities. And so this panel, I think, is a really good effort to see that. And I'm really kind of pleased that Sonia asked me if she could, they could present this material here. So I think we should have a hand left for the people that are here, and thank them very much.
So these brochures are for you, please.
Yes, we have copies of these.
Yes, please circulate.